Years lived on. They influenced the Cathar Christians, the Gnostic Christians, and I've always been quite romantically inclined to like the Cathar tradition of southwest France. I've been down to Montségur, and I love that region, the Mary Magdalene mystery region. I've tried to find out if Marnie knew about Mary Magdalene and whether any of his writings reference her. I think he must have done, but I haven't discovered yet a definite reference by Marnie. The trouble is, of course, very little's come down. Might be there'll be some cave in the Tarim Basin which contains it all. I'm still hoping. Unfortunately, the Orthodox officialdoms called him a heretic, as they always do, and he came to a very bad end when the Zoroastrian power lords that ruled Persia got hold of him, and they killed him, martyred him. But the teachings lived on and survived for many, many centuries, right? He died in about 297 or something. And then they lived on right till 1,000 years later in the Cathar castles of Montségur. And still to this day, there are Cathars around France still. So that was the religion of the Uyghurs. Now, and when they accepted Islam, they said, well, okay, Marnie needed backup. It was Jesus, he did his best, they got him. Then Marnie came along, he did his best, they got him too, they killed them both. And then Muhammad came. And Muhammad, they didn't get him. He was like the sword arm of God, if you want. But the teachings of Islam, particularly Sufism and its more spiritual Gnostic elements, like the tradition they call Irfan, is very profound, very Manichaean in its depths. And therefore the Uyghurs accepted it. Okay, so everything was fine, they're happy, very moderate, intellectual, spiritual Muslims, like they were in Afghanistan, and there were links between the Uyghurs and the Afghans, and great toing and froing, and the Sufi orders were doing their thing, and that time in Central Asia was amazing. J.G. Bennett calls them the Masters of Wisdom. It's where the Naqshbandi and other great Sufi orders arose, out of that milieu. And, I've had dealings with Sufis from Central Asia and Afghanistan in my lifetime, and these traditions are still active. But then, tragically, the Chinese Communist Party decided to take over this whole region with blood and thunder, just as the Soviet Communist Party decided to take over Afghanistan with blood and thunder. And, we know what happened to Afghanistan: total chaos, meltdown, moral catastrophe. I was jumping up and down trying to say, let's have a peace treaty and let's all put the guns down, but nobody listened to me, of course. That was in the early 80s, when I launched Philosophers of Peace. And in the Uyghur region, the Han Chinese have been persecuting and suppressing the Uyghur Islamic cultural identity and their traditions. And if you watch some documentaries, it is a bit chilling, because they're all being put in re-education camps, they call them. Children are being taken away from their parents and put into what they call kindergartens, but they're basically brainwashing factories where they're taught to trot out "We love Chairman Mao" slogans. And it's all a bit sad, it's a bit primitive, Can't we have a slightly more sophisticated ability to maybe rethink communism so that it's not about centralized control of thought and cultural eradication? There was this tendency inside Marx himself. I'm doing a commentary, a critique of Das Kapital. There was a tendency in Marx to think only the big nations mattered. He wasn't that good on the rights of small nations and small peoples. It was a lacuna in his own thought world, which I'm tracing back to source in my critique of Das Kapital. Unfortunately, it had huge implications for the way communism developed. Because if you think that you are the leading edge, the avant-garde of human progress, and your party is the the sword arm of truth, then you will be ruthless in your suppression of anyone that gets in the way and has a different narrative. Uyghurs talking about Muslims, well, what's that? Kill them all kind of thing. You can see how Chairman Mao would have thought. He was utterly ruthless in his belief that you can impose a mono-narrative onto cultural diversity. And so there's one example of this ethnic problem when you have a majority ruling a country like the Han Chinese, who then are very unable to share any kind of power, let alone epistemological power, like guaranteeing their right to a narrative interpretation of history. No way, can't have that. And so you got the Cultural Revolution, which then effaced all the differences. And it's not just the Uyghurs that are being oppressed, it's also the Tibetan Buddhists. Again, not allowed their own narrative, not allowed their memory. It's the eradication of memory in the end. Okay, so let's look. There are other examples. This is not just a Chinese problem. It's going on in Britain and in the UK with the Scots, which I discovered really to my shock and unexpectedly. I'd been studying and teaching in London as an expert in peace studies, done my feasibility study, lectured at London and Oxford. In 2010, I was given the chance to go and live in a castle in Scotland. I thought, brilliant, I can write loads of books and I'll enjoy living on a lochside. And I met loads of very interesting Scottish people, young intellectuals, thinkers, activists. And I began to see Scottish history from the Scottish perspective. A lot of people are active in the Scottish National Party. And I realised there's a whole narrative, a suppressed narrative of Scottish identity, which has been ridden roughshod over by Westminster and by the English majority within the UK. And that it's a precious narrative, precious heritage. The Gaelic speaking, goes right back to the time of Columba and the early Christianisation of the British Isles, actually. And it was influenced by Ireland. The Gaels came from Ireland, and they carry within them a very ancient bardic heritage, druidical heritage, going right back to the Bronze Age. And what I realised is that the English intellectuals of Oxford, Cambridge, London, poured scorn on the Scots because they don't want to recognise their right to epistemological equality. So Johnson was, Samuel Johnson, the great lexicographer, was scathing about the poetry of Ossian and the Macpherson literature because it's all just made up, and that's how you delegitimize somebody's right to their own cultural heritage. And of course this became a matter of life and death in the Jacobite rebellions in 1715, 1745, and in the Glencoe massacre in 1695, I think it was, when people had sworn the oath of allegiance to King William too late. And the English Privy Council, this is what I talk about, suppression of, culture, ruthlessly decided to massacre the Gaelic inhabitants of the little villages of Glencoe, using another clan, the Campbells, to do it. Anyway, this is all very interesting for me as a peace researcher. I discovered all this stuff. I mean, I knew vaguely, obviously I knew Scotland was a different culture, but I didn't realise what a perfect example of this ethnic monopolisation of power that goes on within states, which is actually not even thought about, I was like a Han Chinese going to Tibet and realising the Tibetans have their own story, right? And you see, it's so cleverly done by the institutions, the intellectual institutions of the dominant majority, that you just don't realise it. And the same with the Irish history, obviously, and the suppression of Irish culture, because that's why I'd set up the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for Britain and Ireland. When I met Irish intellectuals and scholars, some Druids, and again I realised that the root cause of the British-Irish conflict is about cultural asymmetry and non-recognition. How do we solve it? Well, my answer is at least we can discuss rather than bombing each other. At least we can have research seminars. We can do thinking. I'm an intellectual. We can do studies. We can do academic research. We can honour everybody's narratives. We can find out the truth by a synthesis of these narratives. We can find a methodology of what I call transpersonal history. So we can look at the, it's never just black and white. It's never, it's not that all the Han Chinese are evil and all the Uyghurs are good, or all the Scots are good and all the English are evil. No, of course not. It's greys, shades of grey and rainbow. And the important thing is to learn the narratives from all angles. That's the Anikantavada thing. Okay, another example is Israel and Palestine. So here we have, again, a dominant majority in the state of Israel, the Israelis, or Jewish, ethnicity, whatever you want to call it, whether it's an ethnicity or a religion, it's both. And it's itself a complex mosaic. There are many different types of modern-day Jewish inhabitants of Israel. But on the whole, they adhere to this concept of Jewishness that is the dominant narrative. And whereas the Palestinians are excluded from that narrative, although some Palestinians are Israeli citizens, and quite a lot of them are, they're not part of the mainstream, narrative of history, because their view of history is so entirely different. They talk about the Nakba, the time when they were, mercilessly conquered, as it were, by the Israelis, and tried to revolt, and they lost their land. A lot of them had to flee to either Gaza or neighbouring states, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon. And so the Palestinian narrative is one of perpetual suffering and injustice, which caused some of them to take up arms and embark in terrorist action. But that's a minority narrative that the modern day Israeli, some intellectuals, Norman Finkelstein and others, have made an effort to learn the narrative, and have therefore radically revised their concept of what it is to be an Israeli, and what, he's a historian, and there are some other historians who've Ilan Pape is another. They're scathingly called revisionists, but I don't know that they are. I think they're actually just people who've done their homework, and who've investigated the story of Israel from all sides, including the Palestinian side. Then there are also things that the Palestinian community did in earlier times, which are part of this story, like the Grand Mufti, who was aligned with Hitler and was very anti-Jewish. So, it's nobody's squeaky clean. Like I said, it's not absolute good and absolute evil. This is the tragedy of the human condition. It's shades of grey, and so far as I can see, most cultures have done terrible things to each other, and ultimately to themselves over the centuries. The question I ask as a peace scholar of all these cases is, how can we get resolution and reconciliation? I set up, when I went to Israel, Palestine, and interviewed people on all sides, I set up the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for the Middle East, right? It's like, how can we actualize that really in fact, when the whole thing is about suppressing narratives and not letting other people speak or even think. So, anyway, that's another example of this case. And then one can talk also about Turkey as another example, and the suppression of the narrative of the Kurds. Again, the Kurdish people aren't allowed to have a story of their own, which is included within the Turkish story, nor are the Armenians. The Armenian narrative is suppressed from Turkish history. We just celebrated I think, is it 75th anniversary of the genocide against the Armenians. I have Armenian friends and I've studied the matter, and it's tragic what happened to them. And of course the non-celebration, the non-recognition of of another person's narrative, another person's suffering. That's what cultural oppression looks like. And it works two ways. Actually, the person that does that then, I think, is a lesser person. And as an intellectual who's trained in the arts of Vada, who has to see things from all angles, which to me is it's the essence of what an intellectual is, actually, is to see things from that epoche. Husserl talked about phenomenology, so did Hegel. You have to see things from the perspective of spirit. And spirit sees it from all angles simultaneously, because spirit is in all things. And you can't be partial if you're looking at history philosophically, i.e. from the perspective of spirit. If I live long enough, I will do a commentary on Hegel's phenomenology of spirit, because I think he got a few things wrong and we need to update the text. I've tried to do that in my book on Being and Knowledge, by the way. So look, there's a few issues which I've been looking at this week. And it's all in the forward to my feasibility study. I'm going to be doing an updated second edition of the feasibility study over the coming months, because I want to make the case for London University having an Institute of Peace Studies. I think it's now needed more than ever. Not just London, but every university. But London is my alma mater. That's where my PhD is from. That's where I've studied. That's where my degree is from. And London is my hometown, if I have a hometown. It's where my parents met and fell in love during the Blitz. It's where they got married. And it's where my two of my daughters were born. And so I want to give that as a present to London, for future generations. And if anyone wants to send me a cheque for, I don't know, a few million quid, we'll set the thing up, right? I want to move on and say also this week, and I want a bit of a pat on the back for this, I've finished my commentary on the Dhammapada, which is one of the great texts of all world philosophical literature. Dhammapada is the great text of Buddhism. It's the foundational text. If you study no other book, and you study that one intimately, you can become an enlightened sage and a Buddhist. By the way, Buddhist, the word, comes from Sanskrit for buddhi, which means simply intellect. And a Buddhist, therefore, is an intellectual. This is all just a mistake of language, right? The whole point about a Buddhist is you do that suspension of judgment thing as like the first step on the path towards the purification of consciousness. You can't be partial and enlightened at the same time. If you want to be enlightened, and that's the goal of being an intellectual, is you then have to cultivate that impartiality, that nobility of consciousness that sees all phenomena as equal. They talk about equanimity as a virtue, and that's definitely part of the Vipassana traditions of Goenka, who I met. But they don't actually explain what that means. What it means is, from the standpoint of enlightenment, you cannot be other than, 360 degree vision. You have to see things in that full roundness. And that's what, and from that epistemological enlightenment, then comes emotional enlightenment, which is love. Universal compassion and love. You then get universal compassion and love to all beings. It's not negotiable. It doesn't mean you endorse equally bad behaviour and good behaviour. It doesn't mean that some evil psychopath slaughtering millions is as good a person as some saint trying to stop it. But you see the whole situation from the perspective of universal compassion. And you then try and intervene as a medical doctor to solve it, or as a metaphysical doctor, if you want. And to bring people back into alignment with the universal consciousness from which we've slipped, which thus enables us to act unethically. We're potentially all cosmic intellectuals here on this planet. We're all enlightened beings. Even the cats, in their own way, have cat enlightenment. And my job as a philosopher is simply to remind people of this. That's what Socrates was doing. He's my other line manager. He said all knowledge is remembrance. Wake up, you're already enlightened. You can already see, from a universalistic perspective. And what I love about today's generation, young people are now, they know this, they're getting it. You know, it took me years of study in libraries and researching and, you know, doing it the hard way, walking up blizzard-covered mountains in Canada with the collected works of Hegel and Buddha on my back when I was in my early 20s, you know. Now you just get it all off the internet. I hope that doesn't lead to a certain blaseness that this knowledge is very hard won. You know, Buddha and all the saints, it's hard won and so should be respected. It's not, you know, instant enlightenment. I still think there's a bit of a danger that some people get sort of false enlightenment. They get a sort of arrogance that they're not prepared to do the hard work and the which is required. You know, but you know, that's why we still need teachers. Okay. So the Dhammapada, yes, I love it, and I've finished the commentary, which took me, you know, a long time. It's going to be uploaded to my Global Green University website, where I have a lot of audio recordings that people can listen to, and the whole commentary is available there, as well as the commentary on the Quran, and all the Christian Gospels and so on. I mean, gradually, if I live long enough, I'm going to stick up commentaries on everything. The commentary on Marx's Das Kapital is also there. And I just want to quote from the Dhammapada because it's, you know, it's on my mind. I've just finished. And there's this beautiful last verse. I'm not cheating by sharing this, but you know, you've got to read the whole thing and listen to my commentary. But this is the last two verses, which I just commented on 2 days ago. It's from chapter 26, which is called the Brahmin, or the Great Master, or the Great Sage. There are different translations possible. He who is powerful, noble, who lives a life of inner heroism, the all-seer, the all-conqueror, the ever-pure, who has reached the end of the journey, who like Buddha is awake, him I call a great sage. She who knows the river of her past lives, and is free from life that ends in death, who knows the joys of heaven and the sorrows of hell. For she is a seer whose vision is pure, who in perfection is one with the supreme perfection. Her I call a great master. Okay, so that's those two beautiful last verses, and I give a full commentary on them, so you can listen to that. A profound text, and Dharma, the concept Dhammapada means the path of Dharma. Dharma is, of course, the origin root term for Druid. A Druid is the Western equivalent to a Buddhist who can see Dharma, see truth. That's what Druid means, a Dharma seer. And so this is, I'd love to translate it into Druidic terminology if I live long enough. You know, it's another task I'll take on. But in my Encyclopedia of Druid Studies, which I've just published a few weeks ago, I do make clear constantly the over-references between Eastern thought and Buddhist and Oriental thought. You know, there are so many synchronicities and terminological crossovers. As was pointed out by Sir William Jones, who's one of the greatest linguists and scholars and lawyers, who was in Calcutta, head of the British legal, you know, provision, and learned Sanskrit and coined the phrase Indo-European. He realised, he was a Welsh Druid, and he realised that the Hindu Eastern culture was the same ultimately as the Celtic from Wales, where he came. And he was an Oxford graduate as well. So anyway, Sir William Jones got there first. And he's in my Dictionary of Druid Studies, of course. Right. So I want to say I've also published this week Peace Magic, and it's a kind of manual on how to be a peace magician. I really enjoyed writing that book. That was a lot of work, though. I mean, it's not easy being an intellectual, right? If you want a normal, easy life, don't become a historian. Don't be a philosopher. It's hard work. But it is very rewarding. And I think what I've done in that Magical Peacemaking Handbook is quite unique, actually. I'm the first person on this planet, as far as I know, please email me if you find otherwise, to connect the concepts of magic and peacemaking. They're two separate discourse fields. A lot of my academic colleagues that I met doing the Feasibility Study and thereafter, they're all experts in conflict resolution, peace studies, they write learned books, encyclopedias, treaties, they give endless conferences, and they're in a whole universal discourse field, and they give each other professorial chairs in conflict resolution, and very, very interesting and highly intellectual and amazing people. But some of them talk about interreligious conflict resolution. Very few recognise this as a problem. And for instance, there's some people at George Mason University, which is probably the most interesting centre for conflict resolution research in America. There are similar people at Lancaster and Kent and Bradford University in the UK, but very few of them look at the interreligious side of conflict resolution. There's a few at Winchester that do. Of those, very, very few, I think, very few look at, I think none actually, look at the esoteric or magical side of conflict and war, which is interesting because in my studies in war studies at King's College, London, I used to go along to lectures. Warriors often invoke the occult for their prowess. They do chants to the gods before they go into battle, and that's a universal feature of warrior cultures. Samurai warriors, American Indian warriors, old Anglo-Saxon berserker type warriors, up to modern day Hitler type, SS warriors, to Jewish Haganah defense warriors, doing ceremonies at Masada. I mean, every warrior cult is a sort of locked into some kind of occult thing. And it's true also in the Mau Mau rebellions in Kenya. So anyway, some scholars have studied that. They've looked at one would say, the misuse of the occult by the warrior elites of the planet. Okay, so what about the peace elites? Why are we not doing the same? If that's what we're up against, right, and we are, and it's going on, and that's these warriors that want World War III, they're all, chanting to Baal or whatever it is they chant to. So what are the peace warriors doing? The peace workers, the peace magicians. So I'm saying, let's up our game, right? To me, you see, Plato, the founder of the academy, was a kind of peace magician. And all the great sages of mankind, Mahavira, Lao Tzu, Christ, Buddha, in their teachings, they're giving a kind of peace magic. Both inwardly, how we can reach inner peace, i.e. enlightenment, but also collectively, how can we reach social enlightenment, social equality, social happiness. And that was the product really of the 19th, 18th century enlightenment in Europe. We kind of took that Mahayana idea, whether consciously or unconsciously, sometimes consciously, there's a lot of sharing. People like Hegel had read their Mahayana Buddhism, and we said, well, okay, so we want a world of enlightenment. We want a world where everyone has access to the 360-degree vision. Well, how will that look geopolitically and economically? What will be the political economy of enlightenment? Well, surely there'll be an end to poverty for a start. There won't be people scrabbling about in undignified ways, eating out of food bins, There won't be child abuse. There won't be rape of minors. There won't be the abuse of women. There'll be an honouring of each other's sexuality, etc. There'll be freedom of thought, freedom of speech. That led to the thinking that eventually ended up in the UN Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, which is in my little book of peace declarations. So the metaphysics of human rights is that social enlightenment that came about in the 18th century. Voltaire and the great philosophers of that period were doing that thinking. Kant and other great thinkers all over Europe, that was the project, was social enlightenment. I mean, in a sense, socialism was a bit of a misnomer, because you can't have socialism without social enlightenment. And by turning it into an ism, I think there was a slight losing of the plot. The isms come later. Forget the isms. Let's get on with the actual enlightenment stuff, Should have been the argument. And most true people realised that. There was an esoteric core at the heart of the socialist project, with people like Robert Owen and Pierre Leroux, who was my local chap, and a whole list of esoteric socialists that I'm interested in, who were much cleverer than Marx, actually. Marx was a pedant in comparison. He lacked the spark of genius. Moses Hess was a genius as well, as Isaiah Berlin points out. Marx and Engels were pedants in comparison. Unfortunately, you see, in our world, we reward mediocrity, and so Marxism became the thing. Well, that opened the door to Maoism, Stalinism, Leninism, and all the horrors that led to. And it was all a mistake. The really intelligent socialists you've never heard of them. I've only heard of them because I've read James Billington's amazing book, Fire in the Minds of Men, The Origins of the Revolutionary Faith. He was Librarian of Congress. He explains all this. Not fully, but it's a good start point. Okay, so how are we going to do this global enlightenment thing? Well, that's the job now. And that's what I'm working on here, and on behalf of the World Intellectual Forum. And I hope my book on peace magic will help. It's a little how-to manual. I mean, if you read that little book, it's only 100 and something pages. It's a very advanced course. It's like a master's degree in peace studies combined with a master's degree in esoteric philosophy. I don't know of any other books that are like it. Nobody's combined the two. I've spent years studying esoteric philosophy, Tantra, Druidry, esoteric Christianity, all aspects of esoteric thought, and so I put the quintessence of it all into that book. So enjoy it, and together we can change the world. I think it's more revolutionary than Marx's Communist Manifesto. Communist Manifesto is a rant. And it doesn't show us how to get there. It has no ethics. You see, the problem with Marx is he totally left the ethics out. I mean, that's absurd. That's like saying we're going on a car journey and we're going to drive from here to San Francisco. I forgot to put any petrol in the car. Ethics is the spiritual motivation to do the goodness, to do the good. And if you don't have any ethics, you have no petrol in the car. You can't do the good. You might as well do the evil. And if you have this idea of neutral science, which most Marxist scientists eventually cultivated, then you just do whatever the party says, and that's just because otherwise you get hauled off to the gulag. Well, that's not science. That's just fear-based technocracy. My fear about the Wuhan coronavirus thing is that it might be a product of that fear-based technocracy. Some, sort of fear-based people were tinkering around with stuff which got leaked. I'll come back to that at the end, I keep saying. Then finally I want to mention that I've also done my, this week, I published my little book of peace declarations. This is another project that I've been working on really for a long time, by going to India and being involved in the writing of peace declarations with the Anuviba, Jain-based organisation run by my friend Dr. S.L. Gandhi, set up by Acharya Tulsi, one of the great Jain sages of our time.